In May of 1991, in a dark Milwaukee alleyway, 3 women found a 14-year-old boy. He was bleeding, heavily drugged, and in visible distress. When the police arrived, they were met by Jeffrey Dahmer. He offered a calm, deceptive explanation. The boy was an adult, they were boyfriends, and they simply had too much to drink. The officers chose to believe Dahmer. They prioritized his word over the child's physical trauma and the frantic warnings of the women who were actually trying to help. By labeling the encounter a domestic dispute between 2 consenting adults, the officers effectively stripped the 14-year-old of his legal status as a minor in need of protection. The interaction ended with the police personally escorting the victim back into apartment 213. They left him there with Dahmer, who murdered him shortly after the officers walked away. This wasn't a lack of information. It was a failure of empathy. In that alleyway, institutional bias provided the cover a serial killer needed to continue. Following Dahmer's arrest, there was a public scramble to find a clean psychological reason for his crimes. People needed to believe there was a logic to the horror. His father, Lionel Dahmer, used his memoir to look for warning signs in Jeffrey's childhood, specifically a fascination with animal dissection and bones that seemed morbid in hindsight. This intense focus on his psychology helped build a myth, the image of a brilliant, hyper-intelligent predator, simply too gifted for the system to catch. But the genius narrative is a distraction. Dahmer made sloppy, obvious mistakes. He only remained free because the system's apathy allowed those mistakes to go unnoticed. To see the case clearly, the focus has to shift to the 16 victims. They were almost entirely gay men and boys of color, living in neighborhoods the city had already marginalized. This illustrates intersectional vulnerability. When identities like race, sexuality, and class overlap, the resulting lack of state protection creates a dangerous vacuum. Homophobia and racism functioned as active camouflage. Here, institutional protection was at its thinnest, allowing his most blatant errors to go unscrutinized. Neighbor Glenda Cleveland saw the danger clearly. She contacted the police repeatedly to report the suspicious activity and the smells coming from apartment 213, but her calls led nowhere. Her efforts hit an institutional wall. There was a profound disconnect between the police force and the marginalized community they were supposed to serve. The blind spot that allowed Dahmer to operate for years was the predictable result of a system that placed less value on the lives of the people he targeted. The trial further sanitized the tragedy. In the formal, clinical setting of the courtroom, the story was told through the distanced language of lawyers and medical experts. The legal argument focused entirely on whether he was sane or insane. This transformed a story of systemic police failure into a narrow discussion about a single man's brain chemistry. This narrative distance was convenient. It allowed the public and the institutions involved to avoid looking at their own roles in allowing the crimes to happen. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison in 1994. He remained unrepentant to the end, even using his meals to mockingly taunt other inmates with the nature of his crimes. While the killer is gone, his story has been revived as a billion-dollar fixture of the modern true crime entertainment complex. Content continues to be produced at a massive scale, often ignoring the pleas of the victims' families, who rarely give their consent for these stories to be retold. As this journal entry notes, the magic of marketing has turned these criminals into commodities, creating a market for mass murder merchandise that thrives on the very crimes it documents. Families of the victims have been vocal about the cost of this industry. For them, these shows aren't entertainment. They are a forced re-traumatization for the sake of profit. When we treat these tragedies as passive entertainment, we risk perpetuating the same apathy that created the blind spot in the first place. Responsibility starts with what we choose to watch.